Hey, so I'm Patrick Cox. I work at Partitions as an engineer. I work with Drupal a lot, and it's a lot of fun. And today I'm going to talk to you about getting data outside of Drupal in a structured way. And like formatting that data and making sure that those objects of data are consumable by other systems, like Google Spreadsheets or anything really. And so Drupal's really great, right? It does a really good job of allowing us to define really complicated content models, and it helps us like manage those content models. We have content types and all those great tools for doing that. And we have like display modes, we have views, we have panels, we have all these things that let us basically create a content model and display that content model really quickly in an efficient way. That's really not a problem at all, and we can obviously build really large Drupal websites really quickly, and it all works. That's why Drupal's really cool. The problem is that when we try to get this data outside of Drupal and consume it with another system. Because all this data is really good, it works really well within Drupal, but once you try to consume it in another system, I think you'll quickly find that the data is formatted really specifically to Drupal, and there are some things in the data that don't really make sense, and the data won't be formatted like you expect it to be, and it also won't be formatted in a way that another system is likely to be able to consume.
That's an understatement.
Yes. This is a very common problem, and so it's like when we, it's just very complex arrays of data and big objects of things that sometimes don't make sense, and oftentimes when you go to another system, you'll be like, oh wow, this makes a lot more sense, but that's beside the point. So the problem is that getting this data outside of Drupal and formatting it correctly so that it's consumable by another system can be really complicated, and the code base that does this sort of stuff can get really verbose. Like if you're using an instant metadata wrapper and just like getting properties off of node objects and that sort of thing, you'll have to create functions that take objects and then get properties, and then you might have to create other functions that take those properties and format them in some way so that it can be sent off to another system, right? So you might have a date field, and you get that date field out and you have to format it. But then in another instance within your application, you might want to get a date field and format it the same way. So that's fine, you just use the same formatter field. And then let's say you want to do it another time, but you want to use a different format or change the time zone, excuse me, or something like that. You would have to create another formatter. And that sort of pattern is really common. We have to create these little idiosyncrasies between fields and field types. And it just grows to this massive code base. And organizing all the extraction rules and the formatting rules that we sort of have, it's easy when it's a small amount of code, but when it gets really big, then it really becomes frustrating because you've like sort of created this code base, and then you are like, yeah, great, I'm gonna define these patterns for like getting this data out of these objects. And then you define that pattern, and then you go on doing some things, and you have to extend it. And then you kind of evolve your pattern, and you have to go retroactively like apply it to the old code. And so that's fine, you've done that once. But this is gonna happen again and again and again, depending on how large the project is. And that gets really frustrating when you have like, 1,000 lines of code that you have to refactor and reorganize just to fit this new sort of structure that actually allows you to get the data that you want. It's very time consuming. And if you're dealing with lots of different types of entities and lots of different types of fields within those different entities, then sort of like making these formatting mechanisms and these extraction mechanisms generic enough to where you can actually use them on different entity types and different fields, that's a really big challenge, because all of a sudden you have to create all these different little variants within your formatter functions and create if statements and big switches, and it just gets really nasty really quickly, and the code base just runs away from you. An example situation that I ran into that sort of like led to the development of what I'm going to show you that solves this problem. The client I was working on had really, really specific and very complicated rules for getting data out into the objects and then formatting that data. Strangely enough, we weren't even sending it to another system. We were actually consuming it within Drupal, but the mechanisms that they were using to consume that data were completely different than what you might actually use, like display modes, right? So we had this problem, and we needed to solve it. And their formatting rules needed to be like not specifically related to a field type. So it's like, okay, we have this formatter that takes a date string and formats it into this pretty date, right? Well, they had some fields that weren't actually date strings. They might just be like strings that hold like migrated dates or something weird like that. And there were just lots of instances of these very strange things that we needed to sort of like accommodate. And the code base, so we started like I explained earlier, like we started just like writing these things, properly creating functions. It was reusable, it was extendable, but it was not scalable and it absolutely was not maintainable because it grew to be so large. It was impossible to manage. And we had multiple people working on these mechanisms, and you know, like you would have a person work on something and build it and it would be fine, and then another person would come and try to use it and they would get confused by it, so they'd just sort of rewrite it in their own way and they wouldn't document it, and so we'd have the same thing 2 or 3 times, not documented, none of it, because time, just sad. But it just, we had very undry code, and it was a big mess. And this is really frustrating. It feels like dying inside a little bit because all the hard work that you put into this thing that's supposed to turn into the objects and collections of those objects into nice, beautiful arrays of data, all that code base just sort of grows and grows and morphs and into this like big giant. It's kind of like a dinosaur, and eventually it kind of eats you, or at least your time. We are all time. And so we need a solution to this problem. We need something that will allow us to easily express these formatting patterns and reuse them without having to do a crap ton of legwork just to facilitate this sort of like mechanism. And so that's where this thing that I call Distill comes in. And it's something that I wrote when I was inspired by that project I was referring to earlier. And Distill, what is Distill? Well, Distill is a Drupal module that enables dependent modules to take data out of these objects and format them in a very, very structured and organized way, in a way that makes sense. And this is the project URL. Not clickable, obviously, because it's up here, so it's kind of useless, but there it is. I'll show it to you later. And so how does it work? How does it do this? This is kind of a complicated problem. Well, it uses object-oriented programming, and that's great. So we have, first, a processor class that defines methods that take fields and field values and formats them and does all the stuff that you have to do, all the dirty work, and then returns the output value. And it sort of like contains these little blocks of code that do this. And then those methods can format fields by 2 different identifiers, really, by field type and then by field name. So you might have a field type that's like address field, right? And then you format it the way you want, you get like the locality and all that stuff. You just concatenate it into this string that is consumable, right? Or you might put it in an array that makes sense for US dates or whatever. Addresses. But then let's say that you have an address field that you want to really specifically change, and it's just one field, it's one variant. You don't want to change all of them, and you don't want to have another if statement in there that just adds the mess of the original one, so you create a new processor method, and you make that one for the specific field, and it overrides the type processor. That's how that sort of works. And then there's a a class that takes this processor object and takes an entity and it sort of holds it, and then you ask it for certain fields, and then you ask it to return those fields, and it will use all the processors and it will use all of those functions to get those pieces of data out of those objects that you passed in, and then return them as a pretty array. It kind of works like this. So this is a helpful visualization because you can take this processor object for all your field formatters, this entity, throw it into the extractor, and then you get consumable data. It's really not that complicated. And then the key sort of concept for this is that we break the formatters out of the extractor. So it's like the mechanism that says, okay, I want to get this field from this object is completely different than the mechanism that says, I want to get this value and I want to change it somehow. And by doing this, you can organize each mechanism appropriately, you can make it reusable, and it's much more extendable. And so using object orientation, you can define a processor class and then create sort of like sub-processors that deviate from the parent class. And you can sort of like, if you just want to, you can like block diagram all the different rule sets for formatting different objects of data, and then create a processor class that encapsulate the largest set, and then create subclasses that encapsulate the smaller sets of processing rules. And that kind of works like this, right? So we have this parent processing rule set that's kind of like, it kind of holds all of the main rules that applies to most entity extraction patterns, right? But then we have these small variants, and so we change different fields and different types, and we change the way that we format those pieces of data in each of these subclasses, and then they all just still go into the distiller, and consumable data comes out the bottom of the television. So let's see how this works. First off, are there any questions about how this works, or like how it's structured?
You have the parent-child. It's like the parent processor, what's in the module, and then the child ones would be like what you have in your own module?
Sure, yes. So the parent module, the distill module, contains this distiller class, and it contains a processor that sets up sort of like a default scenario for fields and field types. And it's worth mentioning that there is a hook you can call within a module that defines a field that will define a default processor for that field. So it's like when you get off the ground, when you install this module with a base Drupal installation, most of the time you can get consumable data right off the bat, no worries. And like you might need to tweak it a little bit, but from the get-go you've got clean data. And I'll show you that in a moment. Yeah, so each submodule will create these child processing rules, and then they can create their own child processing rules, and you can make your own set of modules if you'd like, and have it be modular and extendable.
So when you talk about the distiller at the bottom, is that what's consuming the newly restructured entity at the end? Is it feeds, or is it another module, or?
Sure. So
I guess it could be anything, but I'm trying to get some context.
Yeah, absolutely. So when this distiller does its thing and processes those entities and gets the data out, you get a consumable array of data that you can use anywhere you want. You can give it to feeds, you can give it to views, you can give it to panel panes, or you could put it as a...
I said feeds, I think I meant services. Is what I was thinking.
Yeah, and that's worth talking about, because you can just create an endpoint and return JSON, and that works. And then I'm sort of working on a implementation of this with the RESTful module. I've been sort of playing around with that with one of my coworkers, so that you can like really specifically define like how you want your data to be formatted within those endpoints. And so yes, you can do that, and I'm working on sort of like a default implementation for the RESTful module. Any other questions?
Is this just a one-way street, so it's like Drupal going out, or could you possibly use it going the other way?
That is a really good question. And so this is absolutely just a one-way street at this time. But I have thought about that because it would be really useful if you had something like a MongoDB and you wanted to sort of sync collections with blobs of entities, right? You could, that would make that really easy. So that's something I've thought of, and I might actually be building something for that if I get the time. Thinking about the processors, I don't know if you could like reverse that. You could create an inverse version of it, but, or no. I'll have to think about it, but that's a really good idea. I like it a lot. Any other questions? No? Okay, cool. Well, I think that these code examples are going to make it a lot easier to understand. So I'm going to show you sort of how it works and how to implement it. If you go to my GitHub profile, right now you will see a distill repository, and that contains the canonical version of this module. There's a sandbox that's, I think it's approved to go to live stuff, but it hasn't happened yet because time. But this contains extensive documentation on how this works. It's basically this talk in text format, and it will contain examples and how you should implement it. But then there's a second module that you should know about, and that's what I'm going to show you today. That's how I'm going to demonstrate this while it's working, is this distill example module. And this also contains documentation for installing it and using it. But that's what I'm about to show you right here. So I am in, I'm going to make my text size. Oops. Great. So I am in a console, and I'm in a Drupal installation within my console. And so I'm going to go into the distill module and show you the processor class and the distiller class, just so you get a basic overview of what it is. This is the distill class, and it is really simple. It contains a couple methods and a couple properties just to allow it to do what it does. And then this is the most important one, which is set field, and that's the one that you would use if you were implementing this distiller. And it basically just goes and finds the processor it should run for a given field, and then executes it and hands it to a variable in the global scope of this class. And we won't look at that too long because it's kind of boring. And this is the distill processor class, which is actually pretty much empty. It just defines something and then has a property that is equal to the field types that are available, and a little bit of documentation. And the reason for that is that the main processing functions that are defined are in hooks. And that is so, like I mentioned, modules that create fields can define extraction patterns. And so you could just use distill and not ever worry about them until you want to change them. And so this is where those hooks are for these default field types like list, float. That's where these are held. So enough of that. Let's go to implementation. Distill example. And so this is the example module, and it's really simple. All it does is declare a dependency to the distill module here on line 6, and now it's using distill. And the distill module is where the good stuff is. And this is sort of an example on how you might use distill. So right here in this block, I'm declaring a couple menu items that create paths within Drupal, and they have callbacks that exist within this file. And here is an example page callback that I've created. So here you'll see it's loading an entity, and that's a pretty standard Drupal thing to do. And here it is creating an instance of a distill processor that I have declared. And here it is creating an instance of distill. All right, so right here, this will be defined somewhere, and I'll show you in a moment, because that's kind of a separate thing. But it's just the processor class, like the really short class that I showed you right before, plus anything you've added on top. And then the distiller gets the node type and the entity type. I'm not actually passing the processor in at this point because I want to use defaults. So here we have a collection of set field function calls. And what these do is they tell distill that we need to get these fields out of the entity that's passed in. And so we have a field name here on the left, and then we have a property name on the right. And that property name is, it's just simply what the value of this field should be assigned to on the returned array. And you'll see that in a moment. And then as a third parameter to this function, you can have an array, and that array is what I call the context array. So it basically allows you to pass anything you want into your processor functions. If you have a bunch of rules that are specific to formatting your data, then you can just throw that into an array and put it into that function, and your processor methods will receive that array. And so this is a really good example because I'm trying to get a reference field, a entity reference field specifically, which is the user. And within this processor, I've defined an include fields sort of like mechanism that lets you ask for fields from that sub-entity. so you don't have to like go and make another distiller and like do all this stuff. So you can just ask it for fields, and you can actually assign those values and stuff. There's documentation on that. But that's a good example of what you might use the settings array for. It allows you to do fancy things like that. And here's another example of just an entity reference that's, I think, a taxonomy term. Yeah, it's a taxonomy term, just to demonstrate that it can do things. And then I run this function, which I should separate. It's a distiller get field values. And that function goes and it grabs the array of data that the distiller's been collecting in its global scope, and it returns it. So when you call these set field functions up here, it sets data in that global thing, and this just returns it. And then there's a function that allows you to not do any of this. You could just delete this, and you could run the get all field values. And that will just get all the fields, format them with the default stuff as according to your processor, and you won't specify what's returned. All of them get returned, like create a date, everything. And it should also be mentioned that this will deal with properties as well as fields. It's the same thing to this module. Node ID, not a field, doesn't have field data, doesn't matter. We just ask for it and we get it back. That was some work.
Does that mean you can define processors on not just fields, but also any random?
Yeah, absolutely. You could define in, it's like I can't think of the field you might, I can't think of the function you might call for this, but you can define a processor that takes an entity object and before it's returned, like adds properties. And if they have values and are properties that are on that thing, that entity, then you can get them with this. Simple as that. And if that processor doesn't have a type, then the processor will default to formatting it as a piece of text. So it just gets turned into, like, if it's a date, you just see a string of date things. If it's an ID that's supposed to be an integer, then you end up with just a string integer. And so that's how that sort of works. It's kind of nice to have those properties and fields do the same thing on this layer because you don't have to do a bunch of like weird extraction stuff.
Does your context continue to nest if you had something crazy like a field collection with an entity reference?
Yeah, you could definitely do that, and I have used this with field collections before, and it was incredibly helpful. In fact, field collections was the inspiration for, say, 80% of this, actually, because it's creating entity metadata wrappers, and then the sub-entity metadata wrappers, and then sub-entity metadata wrappers. That actually happened. We had 3 of them that were going at the same time. It was really hard to work with, and so that was that's really actually the reason that I wrote this whole thing, is out of frustration that came from that specific module. This really helps with that. And you literally, if you can do sort of like anything you want with this context array, you can take it. You don't have to use include fields. You can override that processor, I'll show you in a moment, and you can do whatever you want. You can create a field type of your own and do crazy stuff. It's completely up to you. So we're going to go to a Drupal installation that I have on my local machine, and it has all of this installed. Here it is. There's a lot of test entities, yay. I'm going to log in so that I can show you some content. I'm going to show you the first node, which I believe is, no, it's not this one, it's this one. This is the first node, and here are some fields. Go to the edit interface. You have a title, body, tags, alternate text for this field and this image, and then you have some floats that are just kind of randomly there, a list of integers, text list stuff, entity reference, and then a user reference. And all these are just like random field types that I sort of put on this content type that I could demonstrate it getting data out of these different field types. And so yay, we have this thing, and it's there. So this too many cooks in the kitchen node, we're going to use distill with this. And this piece of code right here is what we're going to be executing right now. So let's make sure all my changes aren't done. Yeah, so let's go ahead and execute this and see what we get.
Can you get a little bigger?
Yeah. Which I already executed
You
it.
can't see that?
There we go. That should be relatively large. So this right here, we have a JSON blob that's being constructed from an array in PHP, and that array is coming from distill. And as you can see, we have things like the ID, which is what I showed you earlier. We have the title. No crazy things related to that. We have a post. It has a value, and it has no summary, but if I were to add a summary, it would add a summary property to this. No format information or anything. We take care of that. We just format it how it's specified and render it. We have an image, which is not an image object, is a link to an image that currently exists. We have a number, a float, decimal floats, and these are all coming from lists. So you have a bunch of different values and a bunch of different items. It doesn't have to be that way. You can have an integer field that's just a text field that you put a number in, and it would do the same thing. And we have the user object, and as I was showing you with the reference, include fields context array, we're getting these two properties out just like I asked. And same with like topic, which is a taxonomy term. We're getting a body, and it's formatted in the exact same way as this body right here. It's using the same processor method. And so, as you can see, it works. Now to compare that against what you might get if you just took an entity object, threw it into an array, and put it to Drupal get JSON, we're going to take a look at that. This is what you get when you do that. I'm going to make it a lot smaller. That's way too small. You have a bunch of information we don't need, like version ID. If we're sending it to another system, we send it the canonical version. We don't need that. Sticky, probably not needed. All this stuff. We just didn't add these. We could if we wanted, but we didn't add them, and so they don't exist. We have summary properties, format properties, safe value properties, safe summary properties. We don't really need that in the thing that we're consuming this data with, so we remove it. And see these field prefixes, those are removed because we assigned it to a key that doesn't have that. This image object is a calculated path to an image that exists. Don't have all this weird stuff that we don't need. The language prefix is removed on all of these, and we just get the value. And so we turn this really big blob of data that we don't really need, like we don't need half of this, and we've turned it into something that's makes a lot more sense and a lot more consumable, which is this, which fits in one page. And that's sort of like the concept, right? You have these schemas, these ideas for objects of data that you want to consume. You define them, and then you pass entities through them, and you get them. And it's really that simple. And any questions so far? Any questions or comments?
What URL did you hit to get that? I can't see it.
Oh yeah, so on my local instance, I have this this Drupal installation, and I just went to the distill path, and then there's a distill bad path, and that is this just default entity object. Which both of those paths are defined in the example module, so if you download it, install it, you're good to go. It'll show up.
What are we getting from your sandbox? I threw that on my machine.
Your sandbox. So the sandbox from Drupal.org is exactly the same as this, which I like to show people.
Maybe I missed it. Okay.
Yeah, I like to show people this because it has pretty documentation. The other one has the same documentation, but it's not quite as pretty.
In the README.
Yeah, in the README. And so this is where you can find like really explicit information about this module. And if you download this one as well, you can get all the stuff that I'm talking about right now. Any other questions?
That's nice.
Cool, thank you. So we're just going to talk about how we might sort of like define schemas, right? So we have this thing, we asked for fields, it gave us fields, but what if we want to change them? That's the whole thing that we're trying to solve, right? So as you can see up here, I created an instance of a processor, which is distill test entity processor. Well, I'm going to show you that now. It's in the same file. It doesn't really matter where you put it. It's right there. And this processor is it extends the distill processor that's defined in the distill module, and gets those like behaviors and things, right? And here we've defined a thing that processes address fields, right? And so that doesn't exist within the distill module file as a hook implementation. So if we have an address field, we're kind of lost, right? Not really. We can define these methods and we can do our abstraction in them. And it should be really easy to define these methods. So let's say we're going to create a different method. Going to create a public function, process. Let's see, what kind of field can we process? Let's just say it's just called text. Text, and the suffix to the name of the field type is really important because it says either type or field. And that will make the distill processor know whether it should process it with the type processor basically when the distill processor gets a field, it says, okay, this field is of this type and it is of this name. If the type processor exists, great, it will go ahead and use it, but it will check first to see if a name method exists for that explicit field, not just for the pool of fields within that type. And if the name processor exists, then we will just default to using that over the type. So we're just going to create a type processor, and then we're going to call that process text type. And that's going to have a wrapper, which is just a field wrapper, an index, and an array of settings, which is just a context array like I was talking about earlier. Just remove this confusing stuff. And this basically allows us to format our data and return it. Let's just say we want to return it how it is, value, and that would work. That would process fields of type text. Now let's say we had a field called body, and that field was different than other text fields, and we wanted to do something different with it. Let's say we wanted to concatenate something to it. Pizza. We could do that by saying process field, I think it's process body field. And that's where body is the field name and field defines what type of processor it is. And if we were to process that body field, it would go through this processor as opposed to this one. And it would default to this one. Now, if neither of these exists within the distill processor, it will look through the hook system to see if it has like a default implementation somewhere within the field's parent module, but if not, it'll just return nothing, silently fail. So any questions about like subclassing or creating these formatting methods?
If you have a field type, where you have a processor that will do it for any field type, but you want to change something for just one field name, it skips the field type, or it first runs the field type and then runs the name specifically?
Yeah, it actually skips the field type. It says, okay, when you initialize the distill class, it goes and it looks at all the field types that are available, and it decides which ones this current instance of distill can process with the processor. And then if you ask for a field, it will, if you pass a processor in, it will look for name-specific ones, and it'll go through the fields that are asked in your instance, and it'll say, okay, we have a field image, a body field, and we're asking still for that, and it says, okay, we have processors for body, but not for image. So we're going to default to the type. Oh, that doesn't exist. Default to the hook implementation. That doesn't exist. Default to 0. And so that's sort of how it works. But it doesn't ever run twice, or two processors. It just has a logic available to decide to use one. I should probably draw a diagram of that. That would be really helpful. Any other questions? No? Okay, cool. Well, I was going to show you a implementation of this that works with a module that I wrote that takes objects and puts them into a MongoDB. And it's part of the idea I was working on with syncing two ways, right? But I actually could not get the Mongo CLI the Mongo class within PHP working correctly. So that is sad. But this is another example of using a processor. And actually, instead of doing that, I'm just going to show you how you can actually use that processor object. So we're going to pass that processor object into this function, which creates this page, and we're going to override the body field. Actually, I think. I don't know. I think it should work. Let's just return this. There we go. Post is pizza, right? So we just returned pizza, and we got pizza. If we were to return, some sort of array with data, say, and we would get that back. And that's sort of how that works. We just took the name of the field and we wrote a processor for that explicit field that takes precedence over the type processor for that field, and we did what we want with it. And if we wanted to, we could just go and call, I forget in PHP how you call a parent's method, but you could, since it's a public function, you could just call the parent's processor method, get the value returned from that, and then you'd be good to go. You could just like format it even further if you wanted to do that. You don't have to create undry code. That's completely doable. So cool. Any other questions or thoughts on this?
We have process body field. What's the naming convention there? It's based on the field type.
Yeah, and that's why I was looking up this documentation, because I momentarily forgot, and that actually might be indicating a bad pattern that I might need to work on. But it's documented here, field type processor methods. So it's always prefixed with process. The middle is always the type or the field name, and then it's suffixed with the type of processor that it is, which is either type or field. That is confusing. I should probably change that. And as with the field-based processor, you have prefix with processor, field name, and then you suffix it with field. And it's camel cased. And then all the available things are documented there as well.
Are you found any kind of special exceptions, or?
An exception like if it couldn't process a field of that type. For a while, I was throwing an exception that said, hey, I can't process this field of this type. And that got to the point where it was kind of annoying, because I would go to a Drupal installation and I would expect to process a field, and it wouldn't have like an address field. And so I think what I do now is I watchdog something and just like, hey, you have this problem, and that's why you're getting 0. Or it just returns null. Which is something you wouldn't want to use in a returned object of data. I would want to use like undefined or 0 or false or true or something like that. So I removed the exceptions. But
Not too many anyway, really.
yeah. It's it's like if you have if you're not getting any values, like it shouldn't crash the whole thing. You should know about it and fix it, but it shouldn't like stop things from working. I guess is the conclusion I came to.
So are there other areas where you want to see this evolve into, or things you want to see start to implement this, like other contrib modules, or what's your vision for it, I guess, is the question.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have a couple ideas in mind, and had a couple ideas when I started it. The first is just kind of what you were asking about earlier, services, or some sort of like API module, right? Because this really lets you take data and make it consumable. And so that's why I've been working to sort of like, I say I've been working, I actually haven't had time, but I guess few weeks ago, I was working on getting this integrated with the RESTful module for Drupal, which is a really great module on GitHub. I don't think it's on Drupal.org. Oh, it is?
Yeah, they made a.
Oh yeah, here it is. This is the RESTful module, and it's excellent. It's very, very good. Follows some really great structure patterns, and I really like it a lot. And so I'd like to be able to use the still in conjunction with that to really customize the data that I'm returning.
It's a lot easier to write RESTful than it is to write Drupal.
Yes. Right, so there's that, and then there's also, I'll show you this. There's this module that I was working on, which lets you just take any entity of any type with any bundle and define a MongoDB instance and a collection name that those entities of those different types of bundles should be inserted into. So it's like, okay, you have an entity of type article, you want to put it in a collection named article on this server, and it'll do all that automatically for you. And this is the module that I was implementing earlier that I couldn't get running, sadly. This is a hook of that module. And so part of the reason that I wanted to work on this is because I wanted to be able to like take objects from Drupal, have people change them, do whatever they wanted to them, and then throw them into a Mongo database instance or a Redis instance or whatever, almost kind of like as a caching layer that could be like consumed by some sort of front end thing. So that was another thing that I kind of had in mind. And basically just as a general rule, this works really well if you just want to take entities and make them consumable. So any sort of like integration with any third-party service works really well so far.
I mean, I can see like views, display, plugins, things like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
First thing that came to mind.
Yeah, and the client that I mentioned earlier, that was almost the exact case. We had these templates that were rendering objects and data, but it was way too complicated to pass them entity objects. At least the themers didn't really know Drupal that well, and like they didn't really know how to get objects. And then we started off with all this logic in our templates that was like, oh, get this language and do this thing and all these extraction things, and it was a mess. But then we were able to pass these objects of data into the templates and consume them, just like you might with like a mustache JavaScript implementation or whatever. It was just really simple, really clean, really easy, and it worked really well. It was really performant too.
Unrelated to this, in Vim, what are your vertical lines representing?
Funny story, there's a coworker of mine that likes writing JavaScript, and I like writing JavaScript, and I like writing JavaScript with him. But he has this interesting idea about spacing variable declarations and equal signs and all this stuff. And so these rules represent different columns in which different or pieces of the syntax should belong. It's kind of crazy, but that's what
it's hard not to see that. I kept wondering what that could represent.
That is noted. I should turn that off before I show code because it's pretty obstructive. I actually get a little bit annoyed by it, so I think I'm going to take it out of my RC file completely.
I thought there was something wrong with the screen.
It basically looks like that. And since I only use Vim,
I use a marker that shows like column 80,
yeah.
so that you can figure that out easily.
Yeah, so here's the guy. There we go, all clean. Okay, any more questions related or unrelated? Cool, well, that's all I really have to show you. If you ever have questions about this or run into a problem or implementing it and it just doesn't work, go to the issues on the Distill project on GitHub and I will respond to you as quickly as possible because I really like working on this module. And as mentioned before, there is this example module. Download it, install it, it will work for you and it will give you exactly what you saw here today on these screens.
I have an idea.
Uh-huh.
Is there like a distill like same module like that basically like is so like distill is like an additive module like where you kind of like shows you this you can kind of go from the example and do whatever you want. But it'd be great to have a module that like is a same starting point that you would sort of redactedly sort of do stuff instead. Like
Yeah.
so that you're like that you'd only be working on that little delta of stuff that you might have to customize, because most of it's pretty like you can make a bunch of assumptions. It's like when you get into images, things get weird, or references, like things that like get customized. But text field, key value, right?
Right. No, that makes a lot of sense. I guess what I sort of thought would be that was the hook implementations, right? So any module can declare hook implementations for a field type. And so like you have the address field. They could include a distill implementation that would run and become the default version of that. And that's what I saw, but I definitely see value in something that sort of stands on top of that and provides extraction patterns for like dates, address fields, all these different types of fields that we don't really have in a Drupal installation that's vanilla, but fields that people commonly use. That would be very useful.
You could test it with a distribution, because the distributions will have all kinds of entities that are crazy.
That's a really great idea, actually. I should definitely look into doing that. And maybe we could create something that like.
And there's you can also like dig through. God, I want to say like Search API, but there's a couple modules that like just have like all these. The one I'm thinking of is Apache Solar Search. Is that like it has like default, like it has stuff for all of the regular stuff, and then it has like built-in stuff for the stuff they will probably just think of people asking for, like that. Like you don't have to download an extra module or anything like that. It's just like all like built in. Because one thing that I would love with this bill is you just sort of turn it on and you just have decent JSON connected that plays into what I want out of it for RESTful, like where you just sort of like turn it on and like it just starts spitting out like decent entities.
Yeah, absolutely. And that doesn't necessarily belong in the module that defines the structure and the classes, right? But it could be this sort of like
that's what I said, like, it's still same.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I'll definitely look into that, and I'll see if I can test it with some distribution or installation profiles to see if I can get a better idea. And then the Search API, actually, you're right, it does have a lot of field declarations, and it might actually be worth saying like, okay, I'm just going to go in and look through those and declare all the fields extraction patterns for that.
The migrate module did the same thing. They had a migrate extras.
Yeah.
So migrate had all the core stuff, and then migrate extras had all of the fields that, like they said the same thing. Contrib modules should be providing their own migration stuff in their own module.
Right.
But we're sick of everybody asking for.
Or trying to get like half, modules
Right.
that are super popular, but like nobody's actually like merging stuff in.
So they put that in migrate extras, so you could, maybe
That's actually
or
a
something.
really good example too, because they have their own like include file prefix. It's like .migrate.inc, right? And I could do sort of the same thing, right, where you make a distill.inc file and automatically load those.
Yep. Yes, absolutely.
And I could do like a CTools plugin to sort of like collect those things. It'd be really easy to implement. And, yeah, that's a great idea.
People complain about the CTools plugins. They're actually not bad.
Yeah, they work really well. That's good for setting up the plugin system. I like
it. Easier to Drupal.
Yeah. Cool. Well, anybody have any other ideas or thoughts or questions?
Is this D7 only? I assume?
This is D7 only, but I kept D8 in mind, and all I really need to do is create a or a YAML file for D8 and put those two classes in the right folder, and it will be good to go. Because
Excellent.
Oh, there's one other thing I have to change. There's the hook implementation. I think that's different in D8, so there's basically one line in a YAML file. Good to go.
What are you waiting for?
Time to actually do it. And also like I don't know, there's a release candidate now, so I could do that and be safe. Built some models on Drupal 8 a while ago, and they didn't work the next day, so I was like, well, I'm just not gonna do that for a while.
Probably wait till after this next upcoming DrupalCon.
Yeah, that's actually a good idea. Just right after that, just make it happen. Cool. Anybody else? Thank you.